All right, folks, welcome to the Zoom today. And this particular Zoom is on controlling nuisance wildlife in horticultural crops. And we have with us Dr. Matt Springer with the University of Kentucky, and he is our wildlife specialist. And he's always an interesting speaker. So, Matt, take it away.
All right, thanks, Chad. I will take that as a compliment. I don't know if it was meant that way, but we'll go with it.
Absolutely.
All right, let me share my screen here, and then we'll get it going. Is it coming through?
Yes.
All right. So, as Shad mentioned, I was kind of asked to talk a little bit about wildlife control, especially in horticulture, backyard gardening kind of situation, with a focus on deer, rabbits, and raccoons, all of which are definitely common problems for that scenario. But we'll be able to touch a little bit on a few other species that kind of fall into the same strategy. But I think a lot of the focus is going to be talking about deer and raccoons, which are probably our number one, number two wildlife damage culprits in the state of Kentucky, depending on where you are. Obviously, with this area, you get into a few others like elk and bear. And realistically, a bear is just a 250-pound raccoon. They're their closest relative and behave very, very similar. So I always try to start off these talks with this, realizing that, we live with wildlife. We have been living with wildlife for pretty much the entire time we've been in North America. And we just had different relationships with all these wildlife species over that time. And depending on where you are, if you're in Europe and Africa, that human wildlife interaction is occurring. We're part of the system that they live in. We're using similar resources. Often we are growing things that are really valuable nutritional resources for many of these species. And, alone in Kentucky, we have, over 500 different wildlife species, not counting the fisheries and the mussels and everything else, that range in size from tiny frogs and toads, salamanders, all the way up to our elk and bear, our largest mammals in the state. Um, and the complication here is that wildlife is managed as a public resource, so we're all co-owners of these species, and the state agencies and the federal agencies are tasked with making sure that these species are present for both current generations and future generations, which is a very different model of management when you compare it to European or African models where the owner of the land is the owner of the species of that are and the animals that are present on that ground at that point in time. We've had several court cases and Supreme Court cases all the way back, I think it was 1888 that set the precedent that we all own everything around us for the good of society. And also it allows, for recreational opportunities and what used to be subsistence living in terms of hunting and fishing and use of that resource. However, there's several species that we have waged war on over time. Think, coyotes, wolves, and many predators that are direct competition for our livelihoods, especially several decades ago, that we've tried to eliminate. We still had an active coyote elimination program for, up till, within this decade, and have failed miserably at it with some of them. Others, we have lost species, whether that be on purpose or not, often not. But the lesson that we should take from that is, it's going to, our interactions with these wildlife species are going to occur in one way or another. We hope to find ways of reducing those conflicts and maximizing the recreational enjoyment of those interactions. And unfortunately, sometimes that's in the eye of the beholder. And often they live next to each other, which really makes it hard. But we try to push this idea of trying to learn to live with wildlife by making a few alterations in your own side of things and your own behaviors. Can go a really long way because most of the time these species are making decisions about survival and trying to put themselves in the best place possible to survive in an upcoming winter or reproduce, those kind of things. So understanding that, we're not going to be 100% successful. Sometimes it's going to fall on you a little bit to help deal with these problems and make changes in your own life. it is that understanding is going to go a long way in cultivating a more positive relationship with many of the wildlife species we have. Um, One of the first things when we start talking about wildlife interactions with humans, especially negative ones, when we start talking about problems that are occurring, we have a lot of species that can be causing those problems, and dealing with them is really often species specific. The tools that we use, so there's a lot of value in learning to identify tracks and scats and other signs of wildlife that will help you identify the species you are working with. Often we want to look for situations where you're looking at where is the problem, what kind of habitat, right? Habitat being the phrase that we use for conditions of resources like trees and plants, weather, temperature that allow an animal to exist in a location. So what kind of habitat is around, right? Think, you're not going to have a beaver problem if you're nowhere near water often. Um, so you're not going to have a deer problem at the top of a tree that's 60 feet up. Those kind of little, I don't want to call them semantics, but those conditions really kind of help you narrow down the list of potential culprits to determine what species is causing the issue, and therefore you can start thinking about what are the tools that I have to move forward to solve the problem. So looking at damage on the plants, what does it look like? What tracks are around? Is the plant bit, torn, chewed on, mow it to the ground? Is there claw marks? All of those things are like little clues, right? You're playing your own little game of being Sherlock Holmes and trying to take each of these clues and put it together to solve the case. You're going to try to understand what are the items you want to look for. So, right. So I mentioned claw marks, scratches, bite marks, those things, tracks, and scat all help tell the story of what is present and what potentially is causing that damage. In which case, you may become more familiar than you ever want to come in terms of what does animal poop look like and who caused this poop to exist in a certain location. Thankfully, we have a lot of resources that are out there, like this dichotomous scat key that can help kind of take those characteristics of that poop and get you to at least understand what is a potential cause. Now, just because it is present doesn't necessarily mean it is the absolute culprit. We have had situations, especially down in your neck of the woods, where we've done some reforestation work, had looked at what is affecting the survival of the trees that we planted up on some mines. And we see these conditions where these plants are getting bit. We see a couple different things going on here. Often we would say, well, it's deer and elk that are killing all the trees because they're eating. It's a great food resource. That's what we expect. But we find out that it's truly something that we wouldn't really anticipate being there free ranging, but we know is a common situation now down there where we saw more damage from these plants by horses and cattle than we actually saw by deer and elk, even though the deer and elk were the ones that were initially blamed. So you want to take what you can find and use the tools you have. And I will say it's been, technology's really made this a lot easier and cost effective with things like trail cameras that you can get a cheap trail camera now for $50. It lasts several years, and you can start putting that thing out there and have it working for you and get pictures of what is causing the problem. And that really goes a long way in helping positively identifying what is the culprit and moving forward to hopefully solve the problem. So I'm going to focus a lot here on deer because it is one of our most common culprits across the state of Kentucky, across this entire range. They live quite closely with human beings and they do quite well. With us, they get habituated to our behaviors, they get habituated to our pets. They often will seek out having fawns next to human dwellings because it lowers the risk of their fawns getting depredated by things like coyotes and bobcats and bears. So they have learned to kind of to use the resources we create and also capitalize on them for their own gains. So there's a lot of weird cartoons out there that talk about the fact that deer really are kind of this generalist. We once thought they were only an old forest habitat. Well, really, they can. They're such a generalist they can survive almost anywhere. They're deer living in Central Park in New York. We've got them here in town in Lexington. They do quite well in a lot of different situations. And because of their generalist idea and their ruminants, so they can use resources that other animals cannot. They will take a lot of your activity, especially when it comes to growing plants, and say that sounds delicious. And they can eat upwards of 749 different plants that we know of. And there are a lot of them that they really love and prefer over others. And if you look at this list of the plants that they prefer, many of these are ones that folks plant often because of the characteristics that they have for landscaping and the beauty that they possess. And they'll come in and start munching down pretty well. And really take advantage of the fact that you're basically creating a buffet for them of all kinds of different plants with all really high nutritional value, and put it in one location right next to a house where they really don't have to worry about predators. They love it. And they are happy to stay just far enough away from you to be safe while you watch them. And then as soon as you go away, go in and take care of filling their bellies. Um, the other thing is they eat a lot, and that consumption varies quite a bit across the year based on their nutritional needs. And that nutritional needs varies by age and sex, right? So right now, bucks are going to be searching out um, food that helps provide them a lot of protein for antler growth, while females are going to be looking for nutritional plants that are going to meet their lactation needs as they're growing those fawns. Often they'll switch to what is available that meets their needs, right? So if you look at this chart here, they're consuming anywhere up to 5 to 10 pounds of forage a day. So a good bit of plant material. But look at the fall and how quick they switch over to mast when that becomes available. So if you think about that really means acorns that are falling to the ground. They become a huge component of their diet when they're available. But then it switches over to a lot of forbs, other types of mast in the summer. You get woody browse, which is basically consuming the buds on the stems of the plants, whether that be shrubs or trees. And then also just consuming the plant material itself, the leaves. And then that especially becomes important come winter time when maybe you have arborvitaes that are wonderfully green still and still have a lot of nutritional value. So they're going to take advantage of what is in the landscape. And if that means your garden is growing and it's that young growth that's super nutritious and they can get to it, it's going to be on the menu. And they are going to love the fact that you put a whole bunch of it within a 10 by 10 square, right? They just have to stand in the middle of it and turn around and just consume it all as quickly as possible. Um, there is a lot of value in new growth in terms of nutrition. It often is going to produce the highest amounts of protein and calcium and those nutrients that are needed for either antler growth or lactation. Compared to things like oak leaf that is on an old tree in the shade that's not new growth. It still has value, but it is nowhere near the value of that new growth comparatively. I kind of mentioned this already, but their behavior is a big reason why they are an issue with how quickly they can get used to human beings and navigate our landscape, the fences that we often put up for many other animals. Deer can clear them with no problem, right? So they can jump an 8-foot fence. Standing still, if they're on a run, they can jump an even higher fence. I grew up in Pennsylvania in a suburban setting. We had a lot of urban suburban deer, and they would know the length of the chain of the dog in the backyard, right? And then go stand about 3 feet away from it, torture that poor animal and dog until the dog finally learned that it can't get at the deer. And the deer would just wait them out and then eat the clover that was growing in the yard, which is a highly valuable food source. And often, we still are predators for these animals, especially during a few months of the year. But they're natural predators that are working for us 24/7. Really, were hammered back in the last 100 years, and some of them are just now seeing population increases. Things like bobcats We had wolves in Kentucky. We don't have those anymore. The coyote has moved in and plays that role, but is very different than the traditional predators that we had here. Mountain lions were also here, no longer really. We don't have a reproducing population in the state of Kentucky. We may have a visitor that passes through randomly on occasion, but we don't have that confirmed reproducing population. Coyotes, bobcats are the main drivers. They're going to focus on fawns. They're going to take out a few adults here and there. Bears are going to do the same thing, but it's not the same as wolves and mountain lions in terms of being able to knock those populations back. Humans do a good job of it, right? So we harvest over 150,000 deer a year. But if you think about our population being close to 1 million, that's not making a huge dent in it. Vehicles do a good job. We hit 3,500 deer a year that we know of. Still not going to make a huge dent. So they're kind of free to reproduce as needed and survive. And we see these huge growths in population. Similar to deer, raccoons in Kentucky have a few of these same traits. Where they have really learned to take advantage of humans as resources and protection from predators, free housing in many situations, especially when you start thinking about old tobacco barns and cattle barns. You're kind of giving them a nice warm place to stay out of the elements, and often that place has food associated with it. And they're curious. They're just mean enough and dangerous enough that they can kind of handle certain situations and don't have high risk of mortality associated with humans. Often, we see a lot of these guys hit by cars. We see some trapping that goes on, and we see a little bit of hunting. But with the decrease in the fur industry and the value of these pelts, we don't see often that recreational subsistence harvest going on as much as we used to, say, in the 80s. We also have seen a huge increase in artificial food production, whether that be crops for ag purposes like corn and soybean. But often we see these guys taking huge advantages of other pulses of resources like bird feeders. Or if people are baiting deer or feeding deer, these guys are all over that and are probably consuming more of that bait than the deer themselves. That's especially true if you get out to Western Kentucky, where I personally myself, in projects where we put corn out to count deer to try to estimate density, we would have pictures with 15 raccoons on one bait pile and 250 yards away, another 15 raccoons at the exact same time on another bait pile, and there's only one deer in the background that's going, oh my God, how do I get to that food? Because the raccoons are going to chase me off. So these guys are really good at taking advantage of those resources. So let's kind of switch gears here and start talking about, how do we identify some of these creatures, especially things like raccoons, that there's a few animals that can cause similar damage around houses. So like learning to identify those animals often is important. Deer and elk have very easily identified cloven hooves, where you have two hooves next to each other. Most folks are quick to identify those guys. Raccoons are the ones, because of their size. There's multiple animals like otters and beavers, especially smaller beavers, that can be confused with their tracks, possums, even skunks at this time of year, where you have smaller raccoons that are around. The big thing here is we want to know if it's a raccoon, because raccoons can be quite destructive pretty quickly. So quickly identifying them as a culprit and dealing with them, it can be really important to saving yourself some frustration and damage and money in the long run. These guys have two different types of tracks. The front foot is different than the back foot. The front foot is much smaller. It has a somewhat similar setup to our own hands, except that you have kind of 5 longer fingers that, we don't have a clearly defined thumb, but 5 very long fingers relative to the size of the overall track. Obviously, they're very good at using those fingers to eat and consume things and get into structures and those kind of situations. Whereas their back foot kind of similar to us, has an extended distance between the toes and the heel. It is a similar shape, where you have the front is a little bit wider than the back. It narrows at the heel, but you see the toe length on these guys on their hind foot is still relatively long. You usually can see the claws in all the fingers. So it's a pretty good giveaway. And more importantly, compared to things like otter and beaver, there is no webbing between the toes. That is one of the easiest things to look for if you're not sure between otter and beaver and raccoon is you look for that webbing. And if you notice the webbing, which will be pretty evident in between the toes, especially the front toes, as they grip in wet soil. Their scat is also a pretty good giveaway because usually that's one of the things that we find often in buildings. They are a species that uses what we call latrine, so they tend to defecate in the same location, and it builds up over time. There are parasites that are associated with this that you need to be very aware of because you do not want a raccoon roundworm can cause blindness or other severe human health issues. It's also why you do not want them as a pet. We do not have raccoon rabies, thankfully, in Kentucky at this time. However, it is always a risk. They are a common species to carry rabies in much of the range. So you want to make sure that as you're interacting with any of the problems that these guys create, you take precautions, wear gloves, an N95 mask if you're dealing with the scat is usually enough to protect yourself. And you want to make sure that you're cleaning things appropriately and not have that PPE on. We'll see these latrine sites in buildings on top of hay bales. In natural settings, they'll be on top of logs, often associated with creeks. And you'll be able to see that they have kind of a looser framework, similar to bears. It's not like dogs or cats that's a completely formed stool. Often it's in a kind of a softer structure, more roundy pile rather than a fully formed cylinder. You usually can see seeds that they're consuming. Here in a few months, you'll see things like persimmon seeds, or right now you will probably see like blackberry seeds in them. They can change colors just like bears can, as depending on their diet. But you will see a lot of it usually in one spot. Um, and like I said, unfortunately, they like to do this in structures that they rest in because they do not want to have to go real far to defecate if they're roosting, daytime resting in an area because it's about staying alive, and the more energy you use walking around to somewhere else is going to cost you more in the long run. So, but if you see piles of feces like this, scat, it often is a really strong indicator that they're present. Um, and it offers a really good tool to deal with them is if you can figure out where they're spending most of their time and alter that habitat. It's kind of like step one of dealing with wildlife problems. If you could alter that habitat, take away that area that they're using on a regular basis for daytime resting, whether that be your attic, unfortunately, another building, or even a tree that has a hole in it, if you can secure that area, to make it so they can't access it during the day. This is not even just like taking food away. This is just make it so they have to go further to get food. You can actually sometimes solve a lot of your problems. You also can see the damage that they can create just trying to get into areas and finding loose spots. Chicken wire secured, wire cloth is usually enough if it's well secured with a lot of screws to keep these guys out. You could even cover up that tree cavity there with wire cloth to keep them out. Often you want to do this at points in time when you know they're not in that site anymore for that time period. Keep them out on the outside, don't lock them in. So we look for things like snags, hollow trees, and entry points in buildings and barns. And if you can get rid of those, it's a really great first step using that habitat modification tool. All right, let's move on a little bit. I'm going to throw rabbits, voles, and other small rodent damage into this and culprits. Often we're looking to identify these guys using, unfortunately, plant damage or yard lawn damage after it's already started. Finding them on the front end can be difficult because of their size. They're also hiding quite often. So you're looking for things like holes in the ground or that are about ping pong size, or you're looking for damage on trees as indicators that they're there. Unfortunately, they go after newly planted plants just like deer do. Look for that damage on the ground level. These guys have two, ever growing teeth, incisors, so they chew a lot. So you're looking for small teeth marks on woody plants or other pieces of wood that show that these guys are present and chewing on issues. Um, Often these guys are going to chew on newly planted trees in the winter because there's no other food sources around. And unfortunately, it's when they are going to cause the most problems. Rabbits and rodents in the gardens setting, horticulture settings, often are going to cleanly clip plants at the base where you can see either small tooth marks left or not. Whereas deer and elk, because of the lack of incisors on the top jaw, will have an angular cut that is very distinctive. All right, so how we're going to control these guys long term. I already kind of mentioned that habitat modification in the sense of raccoons. But one of the other big ones that we're looking for that you can actually control are those artificial food sources that aren't essential to what you're doing. I'm not talking about get rid of your garden. I'm talking about things like feeding birds, or in the sense of if you have folks that are using your property for hunting, you don't want them putting out bait at this point in time. There's plenty of food in the landscape for deer. It's not ever been shown to have a positive impact on antler size outside of the far south where soil quality is very, very poor. We have good quality soil in the Midwest and North that has a lot of limestone in it. It's why we have horses in Kentucky. That calcium is present. The quality of our soil in terms of productivity is pretty high. We do not need to be feeding deer to have them be healthy. We sometimes need to shoot some deer to lower populations in order to keep things in balance. But overall, deer and feeding deer right now is not going to do them any favors in terms of their antler size. It's never been shown to work out that way outside of penned deer conditions. So what we do know is that if you put corn on the ground or you put birdseed on the ground, whether that be for birds or deer, raccoons and other animals are going to find it and take advantage of it. And that's one that, unlike your garden that you're trying to grow for yourself or your family, you're not putting corn on the ground to feed your family or bird seed in a bird feeder for your family. You're doing it for recreational enjoyment. Or, it could be for subsistence hunting eventually, but wait till it gets closer to hunting season to do that so that you can maximize the outcome of those resources. On top of removing artificial food, we're looking at the other part that animals often look for. We're looking for cover. Cover is what keeps them safe from weather and also predation. Many times when we talk about things like rabbits and raccoons, other small rodents, the things that they're worried about are avian predators. So owls and hawks. So they're looking to be in areas that have a lot of overhead cover that helps protect them from an avian predator that attacks from the top. Or coyotes, bobcats, they're looking for thick vegetation that they can run into, that they can hide in, or that slows the bobcat or the coyote down from catching. So we can use that in our favor if you have gardens or orchards by eliminating the cover resources immediately adjacent to the food. Animals are lazy. They don't want to go any farther than they have to. So if you start stretching out how far they have to walk to get to resources, it makes that resource less desirable. In this picture, you can see we have an orchard that was planted. They are enacting a couple different vegetative strategies to reduce cover for things like voles and rabbits and also deer and groundhogs. They're keeping the grass mode very short, which is a thing that helps limit raccoon or rabbit cover and also vole and mole cover. And then if you look in the back left corner here, you'll see that they actually brush hog the edge of the woods back to make it further for animals to walk out of existing cover habitat into where that orchard is. Now, that's not going to stop something like a deer, but it could stop something like a rabbit or a groundhog from really venturing too far away. They are in the open, they're vulnerable, and they know it, and therefore they're less likely to use areas that fall into that category. Um, in this, they've also done some other strategies like exclosures here. They have tree protectors on each of these trees that they planted, and that helps limit access to the resource itself. It's another strategy. It's not habitat modification, but it is another strategy that we're going to talk about. Now, one of the other ways you can modify habitat is to try to raise the perceived risk level of that location. We can do that through things like deterrence and scare devices. Often we see, predator decoys, balloons, auditory devices. You get good old-fashioned scarecrow, visual deterrence. All of these are basically just trying to raise the perceived risk of danger over the understanding of value of that resources to their survival. There's no silver bullet. There's a lot of these out there. Um, Often they have varying levels of effectiveness of what you're using them on. Some of them are quite effective on certain species, and that same resource in terms of a tool isn't effective at all on another. Many of these work quite well on avian issues, not so good on mammal issues. And that's one of the problems. Especially true for our visual repellents, things like lasers and balloons work pretty well on avian species, especially things, if you start thinking of geese and blackbirds, they respond really quickly to perceived damage or perceived predators because they get picked off quite a bit. However, if you show a laser to a goose, it's going to fly away. If you show a laser to a deer, it might act like a cat and try to jump on. Their understanding of that as a threat is very different. And therefore, it's just not as effective as, say, a laser scarecrow or a balloon is. Sometimes you can get away with short-term changes in the environment that throw them off, right? So you put a balloon out one day, it might keep a deer away for 3 or 4 days before that deer finally realizes that's not an actual threat. Um, Often chemicals work better on mammals, whereas visuals work better on avians. Chemical warfare is, right, you start thinking about this, it's either one of two things. You get into this adverse taste reaction, or you can get into a unpleasant experience physically, where there's products that will cause temperature increases on skin, irritation on skin. So, there's a couple of options out there. The adverse taste reaction ones are usually more effective on mammals. They require the animals to consume some of it to learn that there's a bad taste. Remember, birds don't really have a taste ability like mammals do, so they're not going to be the same effect, in terms of effectiveness on them as they are mammals. Often they reduce damage; they do not stop it. There's multiple chemicals that are out there, many options. Most are for non-consumptive applications. There are a few like capsaicin, which is like basically hot sauce that you can use on human consumed food. They just need to be applied frequently, and unfortunately, their cost is a little high. This can work, especially those that are meant for like landscaping plants. It can be quite effective for a low cost. But if you're talking about gardens and horticulture components, there's not really good options here in the chemical side. There are some homemade options that we often heard talked about, and, with either ivory soap or chili peppers, those kind of things, or essential oils. There's not really a whole lot of evidence that they work too well. There's some evidence that predator urine will actually raise the perceived risk level for deer, but in times of food stress, all of these kind of get overcome by the need of the animals to consume food. There's also the actual perceived risk component of pets, especially those that have a little bit more ability to go around your yard, around your garden. Dogs are wonderful resources to keep animals away, right? So you can just think about livestock protection animals, livestock guard dogs, and guard animals, and how effective they are for certain predators. The same can be true for horticulture conditions. We use them quite regularly at airports to keep birds away and other animals. You have to have the right dog and train them sometimes under certain conditions, but they are pretty effective. So, if you have an e-collar dog that has some ability to roam around where you are experiencing damage, they often can help solve the problem. Remember that, certain things like bears can cause problems for the dog that they may not be able to overcome as well. So you have to use caution when you use these. Auditory repellents and visual repellents that exist kind of in the same boat, effective short term. They can, when used correctly, you protect crops, resources at the time they're most vulnerable or most likely to cause the greatest economic loss, right? Putting these on sweet corn right as it gets ripe is going to keep raccoons and coyotes away for a week or two. Maybe you get most of that harvest in. You put it out when you start growing them or like midway through, even just at silking stage, you're not going to get the same effect because they're going to learn and become habituated to these resources that you're using to keep the animals wet. Same kind of goes for many of the motion activated devices. These tend to be a little bit better because there's a stimulus that happens when that animal comes near it. Sometimes it's a physical component where you have certain ones that are squirting water on the animal. There's an actual felt issue there that helps reinforce that this isn't an area that they want to be around. So they're a little bit more effective than just the visual predator decoys. There's some that are out there that are electric that kind of bait an animal in, or kind of a fence in essence, where you have these scent released packets at the top, which is what this picture on the right is. Deer comes up and gets a shock off of a battery, and the animal gets a negative reinforcement for being around in that area. They are effective. They're effective longer term because there's negative reinforcement. There's some pain associated with it. It goes a long way in helping and can be used in certain situations. Now, the one that we often talk about for production systems, especially because there's more money at play, is the use of fencing or exclosures. Also super helpful if you have things like a backyard garden that you're planning to use over and over again. It can be worthwhile to invest in that fencing, especially long term in areas that you have a lot of deer and elk issues, because it really does do a good job keeping them out of areas over long term. We have a couple different options. You have cheaper options like a plastic one that will wear down over time with UV, but will last usually several years. You can get into electrical systems. Really good setup, especially for economic, in terms of like commercial production. But not necessarily the best for backyard gardens where you may have a lot of kids running around that can touch them. This will work, especially if you have bear issues. Electrical is the way to go because they can climb over most fences. Same with raccoons. Remember, 250-pound raccoon. Electrical is the way to go. You can, if you're having raccoon issues, you don't need to have a 4-foot high fence, which is what's pictured here. You can have a 12-inch high fence as long as they can't climb over it, and it'll work across, raccoons, skunks, and so on. So knowing what you're dealing with opens up the potential for managing multiple species that have similar behaviors and are similar physical characteristics. Anything that climbs is going to require a negative physical component like electric shock. Deer and elk that can't climb, you just need a barrier that they cannot cross. So it's just that right tool for right species kind of scenario all over again. We talk about small mammals, there are smaller mammals. There are certain exclosures that will work, right? So raccoons and squirrels are not going to really fall into this. But if you have raised bed gardens in your backyard or just have a garden that you want to keep animals out, you can use like rabbits. You can just use a 2-foot high, 30-inch high fence that you prop up that most of those species are not going to get over. A rabbit can't jump over it. It's unlikely to. Possums though they can climb, are sometimes not the smartest in the world. They're gonna be fairly effective. So most of those species are also not going to burrow their ways into things. Rabbits, though they can dig holes, often do not. It requires a lot of effort. So it is an option. However, if you're starting to talk about the raccoon squirrels, you have to have that electrical component to this to really keep them out. Long-term control, if you're having an issue that these exposures aren't going to deal with, you're starting to talk about trapping these animals and removing them. Same with all of these species here, you can use a have a heart cage trap and it's quite effective. We start talking about trying to prevent smaller animals, right? A fence is not going to keep a vole or a mole out or mice out. You can use some other cultural components like, keeping grass really low that we talked about already. And those go a long way. You keep a lot of that cover gone, keep things clean. Even with new trees, if you're worried about new trees, especially with voles, that can cause issues with chewing on the roots. You can put rocks around that and they won't use that area anymore and it keeps those roots protected. Um, that can go a long way, but once again, if that's not working for your situation, you may have to go to the lethal component, which for voles and moles is usually either a snap trap for voles and mice, or a plunger trap of some kind for moles. Often though, the moles is really the one that I will advocate for using the poisons that exist, because you deploy those poisons underground and moles don't often come above ground, which terminates the movement of that poison through the chain. Unlike rodenticides for mice and voles, that the animal, those anticoagulants, the animal runs around and becomes available for a hawk to get, and that moves up the chain into the predators. So kind of start wrapping things up here and summarizing a few things. So food production side, we don't have a whole lot of options. You may need to move to those exclosures, whether that be electric fencing, or even, for raccoons, squirrels, rabbits, you can go to that lethal component. I'm going to summarize the legal component here at the end about what gives you the right to do that, just before we terminate this talk. You can try things like hot sauce. They're expensive. They will work, but you have to reapply frequently. There's also animals just like humans that like hot sauce. So you may have individuals with their own personalities that say, "I really like how that tastes," and come back and eat even more of it. So it's a little harder to deal with. You have other options if we're worried about landscapes to be really efficient at, you apply it. It works really well, and will keep animals from consuming a ton of that landscaping over time. Rodents is really one of the harder ones to deal with. Thankfully, a lot of the landscaping kind of controlling habitat features work really well on things like rabbits and groundhogs because they get eaten a lot by natural predators. You can try to promote natural predators for many of those species by either putting up, owl nesting boxes for things like barn owls or predator perches, which are just basically a piece of PVC that has it's 15 foot tall, that has a little bar that runs across it that they can sit on and help them hunt more effectively. You can try to increase usage by foxes, coyotes, bobcats, by not hunting or trapping those animals if you really are having a rodent problem. If we were using these features, though, we don't want to use rodenticides because I mentioned that will work up the chain, and all of a sudden we have a collapse of our avian predators in an area. So we want to limit the combination of those two things. We want to go either one route or the other. So the deer component, what happens is, this is the one that usually fails, right? So what do we have? What happens if you're getting overwhelmed by deer, especially urban, suburban landscape? So this is something that we do see. Rural landscapes, you have other options that fall under the wildlife control lethally. Many of those options cannot be implemented in suburban or urban settings. This can still happen, right? You can put all those sprays out there, you can do all that. You can put fencing. Usually you can save your gardens, but you may not be able to save your landscaping if there's so many mouths to feed. You may want to think about changing how you landscape your gardens, your houses, to, what we would call deer resistant plants, right? I mentioned 750 plants that they'll eat, so there's not many plants that they will not eat, but there are some that are less desirable or can deal with that browsing and still stay alive and recover. Oftentimes, these are things that we are familiar with, things like rosemary and thyme and mint, sage, the zinnias, daffodils, peonies. They're all going to do quite well. with some browse. Oftentimes they're not even selected to be eaten. But what you don't see are things like hostas, because they get hammered and eaten until they're gone and dead. Many times, one of the ones that we want to look for, and it has an ecological benefit too for things like pollinators and butterflies, is you start picking some of the plants, the forbs, especially that are native to the area that have dealt with deer browsing the entire time they've existed. Many of them are quite pretty. We have things that are trees, we have things that are shrubs, and we have things that are flowering forbs. So things like asters and bee balms and black-eyed Susan, coneflowers, columbines, yarrows, serviceberries, all of those deal with deer damage quite well. They are visually appealing, especially for periods of time during the summer and the spring. So you get some of those same benefits while still not having to deal with, oh my God, the deer killed my plant again. You can look at things like grasses, right? So many of the switch grasses, you have pawpaws, which throw off fruit that they will love, but also, usually can get to that before the deer do. Big blue stem, American holly, hyssop's, all of those do quite well, and they are visually appealing to some extent. So there are options there. That's one of the go-tos when you really start getting overwhelmed. Start thinking about native plants that can deal with pressure over time. I mentioned, we have all these things in terms of dealing with habitat, get rid of the extra food that may be attracting them. We have scare devices, you have exclosures and fencing. All those are kind of the steps you want to take. If all that fails, say you can't get rid of your raccoons, they're still causing problems. In the state of Kentucky, under KRS 150.170, as a landowner, you have the right to protect yourself or your property from wildlife damage as long as it is not a federally protected species. So things like bats, all your migratory birds, including vultures, your raptors, all of that is protected, and this rule does not apply to it. Things like deer, bear, elk, raccoons, skunks, all of that can, if it is your property, you're the landowner, you can stop that damage from occurring lethally if you need to. You must report that use of this law to the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Officer. They have a process, especially for deer, that requires you to, or they would like you to go for bonus tags and use hunting as the tool over time to manage that, and they'll give out extra tags, but you are not required to do that under Kentucky law. If you are renting a property, whether that be your house or cropland, you do not qualify for this regulation unless you have written permission of the landowner to use that law on any wildlife causing the damage. So you do have some protections there, and it's a pretty powerful bill. That means you can trap raccoons and get rid of them if they're causing an issue in your house. You do not have the same rules when it comes to trap and relocate. And to be honest, when we say trap, we don't want you relocating. We want you to as humanely as possible, euthanize that animal. Because if you relocate animals, they A, become someone else's problem. But B, more than likely, what you're doing is you're moving diseases around, you're moving parasites around, things like rabies and ticks and worms to new areas. As well as the animals that currently live there are not going to just open their door to a new animal being present. That's competition for them. There's social hierarchies that need to be set up. So there will be fighting that goes on. Often the animals get injured in those situations, and it turns into a potentially long and suffering last few months of life. So if you're having an issue and you need to trap that animal, we want to trap and euthanize, not trap and relocate. There's also regulations within the state of Kentucky about relocating animals. You cannot relocate animals to public property, and you can only relocate animals to private property with written permission of the landowner. So just keep that in mind as well. There are certain species that you can also not relocate because of rabies vectors concerns. So there's a lot there legally that complicates relocation. And it's not, even the Humane Society doesn't want you to relocate. They don't want you to trap. The end with it becomes a problem when you learn to deal with it. Wildlife professionals in our society says to euthanize if you have to get to that point and not to relocate. The science does not support relocation for multiple reasons. Now that's kind of what I have pulled together. It's a definitely a very quick run through of dealing with wildlife in this situation. But if you have any more questions, start out by reaching out to your county extension office and your county extension agent. And usually, if they can't help you, they reach out to me and they know how to get a hold of me, and I'll try to help find the solutions that you may not have. I had one this morning about moles up in northern Kentucky, and spent some time on the phone with the landowner and the agent at the same time. It's just unfortunately complicated. There's never usually a clear cut solution. But we try to find ways of at least improving the situation over time. And that's kind of all I have. Here's my contact info. My phone number is there for my office, but actually, to be honest, the best way to get a hold of me is to shoot me an email. It's something I usually check on a daily basis unless I'm on vacation. So,
All right, Dr. Springer, thank you very much for the information. Are there any questions? You can either unmute yourself and ask, or you can type it in the chat box. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. So thank you very much. I appreciate you do have no questions but great info. So you got a good compliment. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us today and for the great information. And folks, if you missed something on this, it will be uploaded to YouTube and it'll be on the government channel here in Letcher County, which will go out to multiple sites. But if any questions come up, you can feel free to contact Dr. Springer or myself, and my number is 633-2362. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you have a great rest of your day. See you, Dr. Springer.
take care.